And so what I am going to talk to you about today is kind of give you a brief story of historical political ecology of the region of the Discovery Coast. The Discovery Coast, this is where it's part of southern Bahia. It's where Brazil was first discovered by the Portuguese, one of the first places colonized in Brazil. It started out as sort of primarily an ethnographic project working with Pataxó communities, indigenous communities in this region. Which is one of the most forested and regions of coastal Brazil and one of the few places where there's still kind of an indigenous presence. Wide range of different economic activities that community members engage in, the wide variety of different activities in different communities and different households, how that changes over time. People engage in agriculture, extractive activities, they work in labor markets, they do daily wage labor, and they live in a wide range of different kinds of habitats, more forested habitats, coastal areas, and there's a lot of movement and circulation of people between these communities from year to year. Seasonally, which means is that this wasn't necessarily unique to this community. This is kind of true of rural communities more generally. So kind of interested in this sort of idea of this sort of hybrid strategies of economic and environmental resilience, but I'm also interested in this issue of the sort of the contradictory and selective valuation of indigenous labor, expertise, and creative agency. And both these struck me as important in the contemporary moment. These have kind of a longer historical story. So what I attempt to do is sort of develop a historical political ecology of the Discovery Coast and do it through sort of a synthetic lens that looks at economic development, labor dynamics, and land and resource use policies as a part of one kind of combined process. My history of the region focuses on kind of three pivotal moments. So the early colonial period is the first period, where European presence first shows up. The late colonial Brazil, where there's a radical kind of transformation in both environmental and indigenous policies in this part of Brazil. And then the Anthropocene is where we have this kind of major change in terms of deforestation in the region. So in the early colonial period, you have an early attempt to sort of create sugarcane plantations using indigenous labor being used for the extraction of Brazil wood, which is an important source of dye for European trade. What happens is there's kind of a social, environmental, and spatial differentiation between the plantation system centered in Salvador da Bahia to the north, and this region becomes more of an extractive area for primarily Brazil wood, but for timber and other things, through a Jesuit missionary system. This region remains a sort of kind of underdeveloped area, kind of more natural, a lot of extractive activities, and not so important for the economy of Portugal and Brazil. Towards the late colonial period, what you have this attempt to radically transform the region, and that includes enslaving indigenous peoples, exterminating them, and moving them towards supporting the timber economy. But really deforestation, economic development of the region doesn't really take hold until the mid-1900s. And what you have these days is a region that is, still has some sort of primary forest cover, but has really been transformed into planted eucalyptus plantations and tourism. Those are kind of the main vocations of the region. And so within that context, return to the issue of the Pataxó communities. So they inhabit this area where there are strong tensions with eucalyptus plantation economy, pressures from real estate speculation and from the tourism industry. And you also have tensions with conservation as well. A bunch of the communities are sort of in or surrounding a national park. And so there's been an ongoing political battle over this park. In recent decades, with a lot of different projects focused on climate change, conservation, involving these communities, there's a sort of this kind of participatory approach to conservation, but there's also a lot of tensions, right, between economic experts, environmental experts, and indigenous communities in terms of like how they define environmental goals, what the priorities are, how they define risks, and how this continued struggle to kind of define nature and to secure access to nature is informed by some of these kind of historical notions of difference and exclusion and how that sort of persists to today. One of the things that I really wanted to emphasize as I engage in this historical analysis is focusing on continuities. I think a lot of times we tend to think of the exceptionality of the present moment. And I think sometimes we often kind of overstate those kind of discontinuities and sort of novelties in a way that I think disguises some important continuities, and I think help us to understand the origins, the dynamics, the history of the current social, economic, and environmental problems that we have.